Good afternoon, and welcome to the promise and peril of AI in banking. AI has the potential to increase banker productivity, improve the customer experience, and automate repetitive tasks. Some form of AI are in widespread use in banking, but banks are limited in their staff's use of some of the newer forms of AI, such as ChatGPT. Today, we're going to talk about what AI is, what its potential is for banks, and newer forms of AI. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kia Haslett, the managing editor at Bank Director. I'm on the editorial team and write and edit content for the web and magazine. My areas of focus include bank accounting policy, operations, strategy, and trends in M&A. This webinar is brought to you both by Bank Director and Agent IQ. An information resource to the financial community since 1991, Bank Director focuses on the strategic issues most fundamental to a bank's CEO, senior leadership team, chairman, and independent directors. Agent IQ offers a digital platform supercharged with AI that improves communication and engagement between financial institutions and their customers, leading to happier, more loyal, and more profitable customers. Agent IQ helps create relationships in the digital world that are just as personal as in the physical world, but are even more enhanced. We are offering CPE for this webinar. In order to qualify for credits, you must be in attendance for the full and complete webinar, and you must participate in all 3 polls. If you wish to receive CPE credit for this webinar, please email Taylor Zito at tzito@bankdirector.com. Certificates will be sent out 2 to 3 weeks after the webinar. Before we get started, let me just share a few things to keep in mind. First off, don't worry, we can't hear you. You have joined this webinar in listen-only mode. We recommend that you click on the slide bar at the bottom of the screen to put the presenters into full screen mode. We are accepting questions throughout today's webinar. If you have questions for our speakers, please note them by clicking the Q&A button found on the right side of your screen. You can do this at any time during the presentation. There will be no need to take detailed notes, as the presentation will be shared with all attendees within 24 hours via email. It will also be available on bankdirector.com. If you have technical issues, you may also note these using the moderator chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to take care of it. Regarding our polls, they will also appear on the sidebar near the Q&A button. When you've selected your answer, just hit vote to submit your response. And finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual speakers only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. On that note, let me share a little bit about our speakers today. Slaven Bilic is the CEO and co-founder of San Francisco-based Agent IQ, provider of digital customer engagement solutions, specializing in making financial services more personal. Slaven oversees the overall operations of the company, while also leading the engineering team and managing the technology behind the company's platform from early design to serving in production. Before launching Agent IQ, Slaven worked at Google for more than a decade in both their Japanese and American offices. Specializing in software engineering, he improved many of the search engine's technical aspects, such as spell correction, which I use a lot, query suggestion, as well as helped establish the machine intelligence unit in Google Cloud. Our second speaker today is Brianna Elsaw, the Managing Director and Project Leader for U.S. Digital Services at BMO. Brianna is a visionary and strategic thought leader. Her passion is driving BMO's delivery of an enhanced digital money movement platform with account management features to customers by leading and supporting an amazing team of bank technologists to build top-tier digital banking platforms. Today's webinar will be a conversation with Slaven, Brianna, and myself. I would like to kick off today's conversation by inviting my speakers to join me, as well as a poll question for our audience. Hi, Brianna.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, thank you for having me.
And then, Slaven, would you mind turning your camera on? Great. Well, my first question for our audience, so we can kind of level set, is are you considering or already using AI in your institution? Our answers are A, yes, we are already using AI in our institution. B, yes, we are considering it, but we do not know much about it. Or C, no, we have no interest in using AI at this point. It looks like many of our answers are indicating, many responses are indicating that bankers are considering it but do not know much about it. So I think your guys' insights today are going to be very appreciated. To start that off, let's begin with my first question for you guys. What do bankers need to know about the technology behind AI? How does it actually work or function?
Slavin, do you want to start?
Sure. It's great to be on this event and appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I have to say I'm not surprised by the answers that you got in the poll. I would expect actually that many banks are considering and don't know how to start with about AI. And AI, you can think of it as a new or not so new set of techniques to solve problems in a predicted manner, and that helps automate certain tasks and help answer questions, difficult questions sometimes, and makes it easier to automate certain tasks. I don't think of AI as necessarily replacing humans in this equation, but that's definitely something that comes to mind for many people out there.
Brianna, what about you?
Yes, Slavin, I think you hit on a really good point there at the very end. Oftentimes people, especially in banks, if they're unfamiliar with the technology, they assume it's going to replace jobs or their own work effort. And that's not actually the case. The objective is to actually make life easier, make you more efficient, make the bank more efficient, make it so that you're actually delivering the type of service that's personalized and actually relevant to the customer at that point in time. So it's striving to make everybody better informed.
And how do most banks currently use AI?
I would say at the moment, it's pretty much on the back end. It's automating processes that are inefficient. It's updating addresses. It's taking those back office processes and making them more efficient. But I think that leaves AI as underutilized throughout the bank and really has an opportunity to grow more when it comes to the direct personal interactions.
Yeah, I think the key point to think about here is really what's visible to the end consumers, right? And in many cases, AI can be kind of scary. We have all seen examples of ChatGPT recently and some prior generations of chatbots out there that lead to not so great customer experiences, and that's obviously where some of the risk awareness comes from, and then that makes it hard to deploy. But as Brianna has said, deploying it in a situation where it's not visible to end customers, but helps remove some of the repetitive, mundane tasks that your employees don't really enjoy doing, is where AI is very well suited for and easy to deploy. Another area that doesn't get a lot of attention, but obviously gets a lot of scrutiny inside the bank is cybersecurity and anti-fraud, compliance and regulatory aspects as related to KYC and similar. And that's where AI is very suitable and in many cases already deployed, I suspect, to detect possible intrusions, identify malicious individuals, and help stop them in their tracks in early phases of their attack. And this is where AI is, again, very suitable because it is a large data attack that is being solved or being handled by a data-centric approach, which AI is.
Yeah, going back to your point that AI is useful for mundane employee tasks that they don't like to do, I use an AI transcription service to help me process my interviews. And I've seen firsthand, it's 75% right. So it, removes 75% of that work, but I still have to go in and verify some of that work, right? Like there's still that human involvement, human judgment. So it can't fully replace me yet when it comes to transcription, but I'd love to fully get out of that. So those are some really fantastic examples, and I think the back end and the efficiency is very compelling. But what are some of the risks for banks incorporating AI into their business, and how can they manage the risk?
So first, to piggyback on your comment before, one of pillars of Agent IQ and how we approach AI is a tool that is complementing humans and not necessarily replacing them. And to the extent it can help make your task, 25, 30% easier, 75% actually sounds great in that context. It can be helpful, but it's also important to have that ability to verify and double check to make sure that something that is not correct or is not appropriate for the context does not really get out. And that is what, typically perceived risk of AI is. AI doing something that it was not intended to do, was not approved to do, or is not compliant and in sight with what the bank business office would expect. And having the ability to prevent that while getting the benefit of efficiency, speed up, and automation is the formula that everybody is shooting for. And trying to get that balance right is not necessarily easy or straightforward. And it does, in my experience, take some trial and takes ongoing work, but it is possible with having the ability of acting as a backstop and not necessarily letting it go into wild without having any provision or validation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the big risks, if you categorize them, it's brand, reputation, and customer data, right? When you're looking at the risks that the banks are concerned about, it's overexposure or negative exposure in those areas. So to Slavin's example with chat, where AI is able to drive, here's the most common answer for your type of question in terms of chat deflection, is a really great use case. It's pulling information off the site, being able to provide it up to the customers in a way that helps them be self-sufficient. Or even on the back end, when the agent is connecting with that customer and they're having the conversation in real time, maybe it is going and providing some of the context on that customer's profile and offering it up in a more seamless or consolidated manner for the agent to be able to quickly go through, scan the information, and answer the customer's question in real time. It just overall helps protect, and I think that human components that is going through and filtering the answer or helping to drive the interaction actually takes a lot of those risks out. It's a risk that we at banks have been managing and monitoring for years. Human interaction always carries some risks with it as well. I think a lot of the concern is just because this is a newer frontier for us.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was just gonna say the risks you listed off are familiar, and hopefully banks have the framework that they can add to their oversight when this new technology. Slavin, I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, I wanted to add one other risk that maybe doesn't get as much attention as it would is not necessarily related to the AI as technology itself, but how AI is being evaluated in the context of the bank. And I think many of us have had experience of dealing with the overzealous AI chatbots that are too eager to, keep their deflection numbers very high, but are not necessarily serving the customers in the best way that the customers would like to be served, and kind of preventing them from getting to human help, which might be appropriate in at least some of these cases. And I think it is important to think about when deploying AI is how to deploy it in a way where it's being measured for its strengths and not necessarily push the needle too much to where it is not able to perform as well as one would expect.
What are some potential applications for AI in banks? You mentioned back end or some data gathering. Can we get a little specific for our audience who is thinking about different ways to deploy it in their bank?
Sure. So there's myriad options, right? And I think the best way to approach the problem is really to think about problems you would like to get solved or you'd like to solve, and maybe rate them based on how much data you already have in place or how much value you're getting from automating certain tasks and efficiency, and help that motivate your direction. For pretty much any application that bank has internally, there is probably a provider out there that's providing service for that. And starting with a problem really helps focus the search and helps kind of direct you. And ultimately, the problems that are best suited for, I do think, are cases where there's a lot of data to work with, where humans might have trouble dealing with it. Again, cases like fraud detection and compliance are good cases, good application for that, because there's a lot of data to sift through, and there's a lot of adversaries out there that are trying to outsmart the existing processes by creating new ways of circumventing the whatever is in place, and there's a need to sift through enormous amounts of data and really apply that through a system that can sift through and make decisions in such a context. And again, AI is very suitable for, I think, in customer-facing forms. Conversational AI is obviously getting a lot of attention nowadays, with ChatGPT again getting very much deserved press for its progress, or kind of the fact that it has been a new generation of technology that has really expanded the breadth and depth of types of conversations and answers it can provide, and trying to deploy that in a customer-facing session where it can help answer easy questions for sure, and then as technology matures and gradually get into more complex ones. I do think it's important to keep in mind that understanding the user and being able to answer is not always sufficient. In some cases, you have to perform actions on behalf of the user, and whether you have bits and pieces in place that allow you to do that is an important kind of prerequisite, and only allow for deploying in a manner that can utilize what the backend infrastructure and compliance will allow.
Yeah, Brianna, what about you? Where do you see potential applications for AI in banks, or where have you seen successful applications within your own institution?
Yeah, so we've used it successfully in areas like fraud, which there was a question that was asked with the generic definition of AI. I would agree. It's also the same generic definition that we apply to customers and to banks, right? Where it's the biggest benefit to the banks is not necessarily always the biggest benefit to customers. One area where I think those two overlap is in the space of fraud. If we're able to proactively stop more fraud from happening on a customer's account, that's a great benefit to both us as well as the customer. I think when you're looking purely at the customer benefit, the biggest areas we are going to be able to make improvement in customer lives is empowering their ability to leverage financial progress and money to do the things that they want to do. And that's maybe outside the normal scope of what a bank is looking for them to do. And it's how they need to use their money and how they've got the accessibility to that in real time that has an understanding of their specific bills coming in, their specific cash flow. You see small businesses taking a huge amount of benefit from the implementation of AI. If a bank is able to serve up like you just sent out this invoice and this customer tends to pay in 15 days, you're going to run into a shortfall, right? Like those are very customized, very personalized. They're not rule driven. And that's where I think AI can really dive in and provide customer specific value. For the banks, I think it's on security, I think it's on fraud, I think it's automating back end processes. And then obviously a better engaged, more knowledgeable customer is going to be a more valuable customer for all of us.
Yeah, and Slavin, before we move to our second poll question, I did want to ask you the question that came in from the audience. Do you think the definition of AI is becoming a little generic due to marketing? Do you think that this is just all becoming conflated with different tech speak and that we need to be a little bit more specific when we're talking about AI applications?
I definitely agree. The definition has changed and has grown over the last few years. I think the term has been around for ages, but has grown out of favor for several decades. When I was getting my PhD, it was machine learning, and that was the term that we used, and AI was avoided. Now, with recent successes in perception, so like dealing with media images, with text, again, like example like ChatGPT, there is a notion that we are close to a tipping point and the technology is advanced enough that some of the early promises of AI are becoming to fruition. But there's definitely a lot of marketing influence where everybody needs to have something AI or they're not relevant. And techniques that are used underneath might be simplistic, might be very manual in nature, but they are still being represented as AI, at least in marketing circles. And I don't think that's ideal, but I do think, in my mind, it really comes down to thinking about the problem and thinking of AI as solving the problem. And to the extent that that is happening and you're getting the value, it does not necessarily matter what kind of solution, what kind of implementation underneath the hood, so to say, there is, because when the user interface and user experience becomes seamless, that's when you get the value. If you need to know what it is and how it works to be able to get value out of it, it's not commonplace and it's not going to have the impact that it has. And I do believe we are getting to a point now where user experience and interface can be simple enough that you as a user don't need to care what's under the hood. And to that extent, we are reaching kind of that promise of the AI. I do want to add, in banking context, there are additional constraints that make it harder to deploy or harder to kind of reach that AI level that we think is possible in general. And I do think a lot of that is to do with the APIs and kind of ability again to get the data or perform the actions that are necessary that AI would or should perform to solve the problem, compliance and regulatory kind of constraints, and several others, which make it harder to deploy an end-to-end solution which provides seamless experience and great user value.
Well, I'm definitely going to ask you about regulators and AI. But before that, I'd like to move to our second poll question. For our audience, what is or was the hardest aspect in deciding whether to deploy AI or not within your institution? A, if it should be customer facing or not. B, how to evaluate if it would be helpful. C, should I build or buy? Or D, what partners might be able to help? And I do believe we can only pick one of these options, but I'm sure there is
like multiple.
These might be coming up for banks. It looks like our majority vote is how to evaluate if AI would be helpful. So before I move on to regulators, which I also know is a big interest, Slav, you just alluded to that. Do you guys want to comment on how banks can evaluate whether an AI solution would be helpful to their bank? What are some questions they should be asking? What are some metrics or things that they should be thinking about?
Well, from my perspective, I think it goes back to what I alluded to earlier. You really have to actually know who you're solving the problem for. If you're solving it for your front end customer, then really driving value is going to be based off of the insights you can give them, how personalized it can be. Are you stepping over that line that gets to be too creepy, to in your face, to my phone is listening to me type of an approach? Or are you actually driving the value that they're looking for? If you're looking at it from the perspective of internally, is there operational efficiencies you can drive? Is there ways to enhance the technology? Are you making things easier on your associates? So I think it's really around knowing who you're solving the problem for and what their needs are before you determine whether or not it's a right fit.
It's a great perspective. I'd like to add like a maybe more practical solution for specific context of customer-facing conversational AI. And I've actually written like a fairly extensive blog post, or several blog posts on this topic. But one way to do it is really to get some transcripts from your call center, right? See what types of questions customers are asking, get a small sample of them, a couple hundred or so, and manually look at them, evaluate them, assign them a topic or intent, basically what the problem they're trying to solve, classify them as to whether they're kind of FAQ type of questions that you can answer generically, or they're personal finance related questions that you need to have access to the core API or some data from the core in order to be answered, and use that to, and then obviously next step would be to see of the FAQ questions, which questions can the AI answer for in place, and then for the questions that do have personal data, that need to access personal data, make an assumption whether you would integrate with the core or not, and that will give you, like, this process, it has like 6 or 7 steps, should give you sample of this is how many answers I can handle in a fully automated fashion. And you'll probably get an answer anywhere between 20 and 60%, depending on how you go through this process. And you can do it. Nice thing about this, you can do it without a lot of technology and without a lot of overhead.
So, what are regulators saying about the use of AI in banking, and what do regulators expect from banks that use AI?
I think that's actually a moving target. It's going to continue to get more and more refined as we continue to implement AI. I think there's the obvious ones out there. Are you using AI in a way to discriminate against lending practices, banking practices? Are you overexposing customer data? Are you forcing them into marketing campaigns that they may not have been interested in the past? So I think it's around taking the regulator lens that we have today. I would say apply a element of, there's model regulators out there today around fraud and money movement as well. And I would say apply a lot of the questions and the standards that those regulators use when they're coming in to evaluate your organization, and apply that a bit more broadly across all of the implementations you're looking at for AI. I think it's a good starting base. And if you're coming at it from a do no harm and service the customer approach first, I think you can usually meet a pretty safe middle ground with the regulators.
Yeah, and I think it is important to, again, think of AI as just another tool in the toolkit, and anything that applies to other tools that you're using in the back office is likely going to apply for AI. So if decision has been made, why was it made? Was it made consistent with the rules and regulations which are currently in place? And whether it can be replicated. And I think these are things that are going to be first looked at. I do think that transparency as to why AI has made the decision is one of the big open questions, from research perspective. As models get more complicated and more complex, it gets harder and harder to explain that. And that's why sometimes simpler models are easier to use, easier to deploy, because there is a fairly straightforward path from some data to the answer that AI is putting. But as Brian has said, this is a moving target, and I do think it is important to be able to log and kind of make it auditable, all the decisions that AI has made, be it in form of transcript or some other, be able to justify them, again, to the extent possible from the data that you have, and then be paying attention to regulations as they change, as I'm sure they will be changing as regulatory bodies are looking at deployment of various AI systems. Their constraints or their suggestions will evolve, and the regulations will evolve too. So it is not do it once and kind of assume it's done. It is something that will have to evolve.
If bankers want to pursue AI applications in areas that are sensitive, like lending or maybe consumer-facing, consumer data gathering, what kind of questions should a bank ask a potential partner or vendor to make sure that they're comfortable with the technology or can answer regulators' questions?
I'm going to fall back on some of the same context that I had said earlier. We leverage partners and vendors from time to time with things like money movement solutions or cybersecurity solutions. And the same rigor that we put into evaluating their models is a lot of the same due diligence and rigor that you should be putting into how you're evaluating their AI solutions. And for a while, there is probably going to have to be an element of test and learn. Implemented in a small subsets, evaluate the solution and the results, and then see if it actually fits for the purpose that you had evaluated it for. So there will be an element of monitoring that you're going to have to probably put into start, and then leverage that as part of the underlying foundation of documents and insights that you use to prove to regulators, to your internal stakeholders, that it is driving the results you were expecting, that it is not inserting a negative variance or a negative set of implications on the customer that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the evaluation of AI vendors should be kind of similar to evaluation you have for other types of vendors. So if sending data back and forth, probably want them to be SOC 2 Type 2 certified. You want to make sure that data is encrypted in flight and at rest, that PII is anonymized to the extent it can be. Obviously, some applications do require some PII data, but that should be signed off on and kind of verified that that's the only data that is being used, and make sure that people who have access to the data have to follow the restrictions and processes that have been agreed to, so that there's no data leakage or otherwise loss, and then that the process is being followed as intended and not bypassed. As far as the models are concerned, the actual kind of meat of the problem is really that the results are replicable and to some extent predictable, to the extent it's possible to explain them. It is important from a regulatory perspective. And then ultimately think of AI model as in its purest form as a living, breathing thing that changes over time. And just like, your employees are not necessarily getting trained once and then left their own uh, means after that, they are getting retraining and modification as they go. AI systems will go through the similar thing. So it's necessary to validate at regular intervals or with random sampling or some other techniques to make sure that it is still doing what it has. So um, there is some overhead in doing this, but ultimately it should be much lower overhead than the benefit, the value that AI provides in terms of automation and efficiency increase. But all of this is fairly surmountable and is doable, and there are banks out there and non-banks that are doing it very, very successfully. So
I like what you guys made the point of is asserting, the existing processes and guidance that banks can use in their own business currently and apply that to oversight of AI tools, if that makes sense. The third part, model risk management, change management, things like that. So ChatGPT has been in the news, and businesses can license a ChatGPT through a paid professional version of Microsoft Office Suite and leverage the tool to accomplish tasks more efficiently. Given that, what should bankers know about AI technology, specifically like ChatGPT, the LLM, large language modeling, if I'm correct?
yeah, so definitely ChatGPT is one of the latest or most successful instantiation of techniques based on LLMs, large language models, and transformers. These are some techniques that actually were developed at Google when I was there about 10 years ago. So they're not new techniques. They're not something that just came out of nowhere. They are the next iteration, better iteration of previous models. So they are in line, with what you would expect as an improvement. And 6 months from now, 12 months from now, there's going to be ChatGPT plus or some other model that's going to be even better. And it's probably going to come sooner than difference between GPT plus 2 and ChatGPT, which was about 18 months, I believe. So that's accelerating, and it's going to keep changing. The actual techniques, again, I don't think it's important for banks to understand in a lot of detail how they work. And to the extent that you have to understand how they work, they're not working well, right? So I think focusing on the kind of input outputs and just utilizing them as a black box to some extent is one way to start. That said, I would not suggest for many banks to try to deploy one on their own without assumption that they're going to require a significant investment. A much easier, better way would be to partner with a vendor that specializes in that, and obviously go to the due diligence, vendor acquisition process that you normally follow to some extent, but that is much easier way to get to a working deployable system. ChatGPT and a lot of other machine learning AI models out there are open source, and you can get a lot of data. You can get them as APIs, by paying just as you use. But in most cases, I would expect some customization or some bank-specific needs would have to be addressed for it to be really deployable. And I think as of today, the easiest path to get there is working with a vendor that's versed in this and has also experience working with banks, and that can take a somewhat complex and general tool and make it more specific and fine-tune for the specific bank needs and for specific problems with the bank that's trying to solve. It is not, a solution for every problem. And while it seems it's very capable, while it is very capable and very broad at what it can do, there's definitely holes that will need to be plugged to really deploy it successfully in any function inside the bank at this point. So
Yeah,
Brianna,
I would
go ahead.
echo that actually. I think there is a lot to be said about banks knowing where they're actually right fit for driving a technology versus finding a partner that can help them accelerate in a journey. So I would say at this point in time, unless you're in the one of the very, very large banks and have the funding to put against driving a really strategic implementation on behalf of a longer roadmap, finding that partner that you trust and have a working relationship with is a good way to dip your toe into the experience.
And
just
Brianna,
to
you
add one
went.
thing before we go, and based on my experience, again, what I've seen at Google and some other hyperscalers that are very much centric about AI development, when you try to build it in-house, even using open source and a lot of tooling that's available out there, it is always more expensive and more time consuming than you imagine initially. It seems so simple and easy, but it's not. And if you do engage in the journey, start on the journey, be aware that it might be a little bit longer and a little bit more complicated to get to the results. And again, dealing with when there's somebody who's gone through the journey can help get there faster.
Both of you have mentioned AI as a potential for fraud monitoring and compliance work. I wanted to flip that and ask you, what is a deep fake and how does AI figure into deep fakes? How worried should banks be about AI generated deep fakes?
It's a good question. So deep fakes are just models or emulations of individuals or entities. It can be other things, not necessarily individuals, and pretending to be them. So you can think of them as fraudsters to some extent, applied to the specific context. Banks should be aware of them, and obviously fraud is a big issue that needs to be dealt with advent of the AI and with technology behind deepfakes becoming more sophisticated, it will become harder to identify and makes it a harder problem. And that's why I do believe we will see more and more AI, more sophisticated AI being used to kind of try to defend from more sophisticated attacks, which you can think of as deepfake. So it is an ongoing battle, and it will continue. And I do think one thing to keep in mind is really that deepfakes are only going to get better, and the problem is going to get harder. And at some point, it will not be tractable or easily detected even by average human or trained human. So I do think it will become a necessity to deal with in an automated fashion where you have friendly AI kind of fighting the
Yeah,
unfriendly AI
by the
and, and
using
making
good
sure that
AI.
the protection rail or the boundary is not breached. So
Yeah,
Do you have AI at your bank?
yeah, we do. And we do leverage it when we're looking at things like money laundering, looking to account takeovers, those kind of activities that the fraudsters are going in. They're trying to gather data on a subset of customers. They're trying to imitate customers or imitate our agents, actually asking for information in order to dive deeper in. And the banks have been figuring out what's the right combination of tools to combat that. And AI definitely plays into, are we able to proactively combat that? Better messaging to our customers, keeping them aware of the newest types of scams and fakes that are out there. And then just continually trying to inform customers about what they can do to make sure that they're in a safe banking situation.
All right, well, I wanted to go ahead and ask our third poll question for our audience. If you are currently using or considering using an AI application, what area would you use it in? A, customer facing or self-service, B, employee support, C, operational like fraud prevention, or D, all of the above. And as you are responding to the poll, this is a reminder that you can submit questions for Slavin or Brianna to answer while you have them. I think that your guys' initial answers to this question earlier in the webinar are leading some of our audience with their answers. It looks like 50%, more than 50% of our audience is interested in using or considering using AI in all of the above: customer facing, employee support, and operational. Do you guys have any thoughts on where our audience is thinking about using AI? Any recommendations?
All of the above sounds about right. I'd say, I mean, so I do think, it's important not to try to do everything at the same time. And again, maybe prioritize based on the ROI, based on the value add. Some of these or some subsets of these areas, they're fairly broad and there's a lot that can be done. Obviously, customer facing is one area that's very dear to heart to us as Agent IQ. That's what we specialize in. And I do think focusing on maybe identifying the problem and narrowing that is important. Again, I would highly recommend working with the vendor because it is unlikely that off-the-shelf stuff works good enough, and it's also unlikely that do it in-house is going to give you the results at the rate or at the investment that you expect. I do think it's important to start small and iterate, and to the extent that you can limit the impact or run, let's say you have an AI system that can act as a self-service or even as a fraud prevention, you can have it run as a shadow, right? Not necessarily in control, but monitor its decisions and monitor how it would act on certain inputs and verify that it's doing what you want, and then only gradually promote it to be in charge in some subset of cases, or in customer-facing applications, give them the ability to easily leave that experience. So for example, in our deployments, we encourage all of our partners to have that escape hatch, like, hey, here's the self-service, I can play with it, I can get the answer that I want, but if at any point I feel I'm not being serviced as well as I like, I can ask for human and I can get that human help. So having a way to escape from that negative hatch, and then having the ability to review that post fact and make adjustments. But starting small, iterating, improving, and then expanding.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm also a big proponent of going across the board. However, taking it from a bank lens, I know sometimes getting through all of the hurdles, the approvals, the sign-offs from legal, compliance, all of the different groups that want to make sure the checks and balances are in place, it can be easier to go iteratively through the organization. Sometimes the assisting an employee role is an easy way to minimize the risk. There's the employee oversight to what is actually deployed or said in front of a customer, and that helps alleviate some of the concerns that they're going to put something out that might cause a reputation risk or a data leak. So I think getting a really decent idea of where you want to take it, who you have to inform, the type of knowledge you have to continue to expand for the folks that you're convincing or selling this technology to, And then starting to alleviate those concerns is a good way to build up your funnel for how you're going to implement AI across the board. Chat's an easy way because you can actually look at, saying here's chat deflection. There's always an agent on the other side that you can actually implement. Pairing that with, okay, now I'm going to actually help those agents and what they're going to answer, and then you continue to build as you're going through and layering more and more of the AI into the solution and building comfort across the implementation.
I'd like to bring up a technology that we haven't talked about, the core. How important is a core provider in terms of using, leveraging, implementing AI successfully in a bank? Are some cores better than others, or do you have any suggestions about how to even get around the core? Tell me about that.
Let's go with how you get around the core. Yeah, well, so not every bank has the opportunity to either be in the midst of replacing a core or working with a new core. Some are, and that's fantastic. And you can sort of reset things from the get-go. I happen to work for a bank that has 200 years worth of history, which is a fantastic foundation to build from. However, that means not that our cores are 200 years old, but that the technology is built off of an older legacy foundation when it comes to the core technology. And so really looking at areas that you can implement, how you can continue to expand the data that you're leveraging. I think AI doesn't have to be inhibited by your core or your technology. You can use it actually as a way to help facilitate where your current technology stack is falling maybe shy of short of where you'd like it to be.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Integrations with core are notoriously expensive and time-consuming, and there's definitely a lot of value to be reaped without having those in place. And I do think when we talked about kind of selecting the problem and starting small, I do think favoring areas which don't require core integrations and starting with them is obviously very prudent. To the extent you have the ability to influence or decide your core, I do think it's important now more than ever to have the ability to import and export data, to get API access to certain data in the core. And to the extent it's possible, obviously it would be ideal to work into contracts so it's not prohibitive in terms of expense and or money or time. But in reality, many banks are on 7-year contracts and they're not able to negotiate and have the leverage. And ultimately, that's why it is important to consider going around the core where it's possible. And from our experience, there is definitely sufficient value to be reaped there and can be still very useful in help efficiency, can help with automation. And yes, there are going to be some types of tasks which are desirable but not necessarily doable without paying the price. And that is the state of banking today, and that's something that can be worked around.
So for our audience, what if they want to implement AI and we saw it's across the board and they're curious, but they're not doing it yet. What should they do to prep their data or their data capabilities to better bring in AI tools into their bank? What about their tech stack? Is there any optimization they need to be doing ahead of working with a partner on this?
So I can start. So I do think there is, first step is really awareness, and AI is very data-centric technology and depends on the data, depends on having a lot of the data, having access to the data. So that's why it is important to have infrastructure in place that allows accessing data, reading, writing data through the API. So having those APIs in place, having, to the extent it's desirable, to having the ability to perform transactions again through APIs is one important piece. For bigger banks out there, it probably makes sense to have some kind of data lake or data repository where data is joined and in some way cleaned and organized, because no matter how good the AI, the technology is, if it's dealing with subpar data, results will not be great. So data to, or steps to kind of clean up and organize the data are very important. When doing this, obviously understanding the future application and intended use is important, but just making the data accessible and easy to consume for human employees of the bank is definitely a good direction to go in, because if humans can read it, AI will be able to do something with it, right? And that's another important step. So helping organize the data. And then the third one is more kind of organizational, is really deciding on what your risk tolerance is, or where you would like to be in the adoption curve, right? Some banks definitely want to lead the charge and they want to be in the forefront, are very willing to experiment and adapt and learn and improve. Some other banks are very much like to watch and observe from the background and deciding that and then creating a posture on direction you want to take to based on your risk profile is an important step. And to the extent you have these pieces together, it makes it easier to incorporate or deploy AI when that becomes timely and relevant.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I would say don't be afraid to build forward. You don't have to go back and fix everything from the past, and you don't have to restructure a whole bunch. But if you have a game plan of how to make your data better moving forward, and you start to supplement and plug holes and add data when you've got that landing zone, your data lake, or however you want to look to implement that, I think that's a great step forward, right? You don't have to go back and retroactively fit things.
And data is never perfect. It's never complete. To some extent, there's always going to be exceptions and edge cases and such. So I do think having something in place that works most of the time is sufficient. And then just it is possible typically to have workarounds for cases that are missing data or incompleteness or imperfection of some form. So.
Well, thank you, Brianna and Slavin, for being with me this last hour. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. As a reminder to our audience, you will receive the recorded version of this webinar within 24 hours, and we will also post it on bankdirector.com. Thank you so much to Slavin, Brianna, and Agent IQ for co-hosting this webinar with me today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.